All right, for people who are starting to file in, if you are here for the webinar on annexation and the aftermath of the US election, you are in the right place. Just sit tight. We have a lot of people who RSVP'd, so we're going to give it a little time for people to file into the room, and we'll be starting in just a moment. And again, we are going to start the webinar soon. Thank you for your patience. We're just letting people into the room. We'll give it another, maybe another minute, and then we'll get started. If you are here for the annexation and the aftermath of the US elections webinar, you're in the right place. Give it just a few more minutes, a few more seconds. Waiting for the clock to strike 10:02, and then we'll go. All right, so we're gonna get going. People are still filing into the room. We are gonna get started now, so people may miss the introductions. This, of course, is being live streamed, and it's also being recorded, and that will be posted, the recording later on, so people can get the part they missed later on. So welcome, good morning. I'm Lara Friedman. I am the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today entitled Annexation and the Aftermath of the US Election, Analysis and Expectations. When we planned this webinar over a week ago, we expected that in the wake of the US elections, the Israeli government and settlers would do everything they could to capitalize on the waning days of the Trump administration, which has, of course, supported openly Israel's settlement enterprise and the annexation agenda, as evidenced by the Trump plan. Developments over the past week have regrettably proved this expectation entirely accurate. So while many panels are being convened right now to discuss what the Biden administration might do or might want to do politically, we want to focus the discussion today on annexation and what a Biden administration will mean specifically with respect to annexation of the occupied territories. So to shed light on the topic today, we have with us three experts and friends whom I will introduce very briefly here. For your full bio, for the full bio, see the online invitation to this webinar. So going alphabetically, we have Salem Barame, who is the executive director of the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, PIPD. Salem is currently a non-resident fellow at the US Middle East Project and previously worked as an international affairs advisor to Dr. Hanan Ashrawi at the PLO and the Palestine Investment Fund. Thank you, Salem. Second, we have Diana Butsu. Diana is a Canadian Palestinian human rights attorney. In 2000, Diana moved to the occupied West Bank, where she served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team and later to the Palestinian president. Diana is the co-host of a new podcast by the Institute for Middle East Understanding, IMEU, called This is Palestine. Thank you, Diana. And last, we have Hagai Elad. Hagai is the executive director of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. Previously, Hagai was director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, from 2008 to 2014, and the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance from 2000 to 2006. So thank you, Hagai. Some quick housekeeping, as is our regular practice. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion between the panelists and myself. In addition to my own questions, and I have a lot of questions, we are eager to take audience questions, and those can be submitted via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the panel. There's a colleague, my colleague Kristen, is going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A box and will be curating those questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Also, please note this is being, as I said, live streamed on Facebook, and a recording will be posted later. In terms of technical issues, if you have problems, put that into the chat function. Do not put your questions into the Q&A function because we won't see them probably. So that's not what the Q&A, that's not what the chat function is being used for. So with that, we are going to begin. I want to start with Diana. So Diana, can can we start off by sort of just doing terms of reference here? I want to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about when we say annexation in the title of this webinar and in general, and also what a discussion of annexation should encompass. So for example, how this relates to settlement building or home demolitions or settler violence, or there's other topics we're going to talk about in this webinar. So can you talk about what is annexation? And can you also talk about de facto versus de jure annexation, just setting our terms straight? Why is this distinction important? And maybe is one worse than the other, or are they equally bad and we should pay attention to them equally?
Thank you very much, Lara, for the question. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here with you, with Salim and with Hagai. And thank you for everybody at FMEP for putting this together. I know there's a lot of people behind the scenes who do a lot of hard work, so I want to acknowledge the excellent work that you're doing in putting this together, and always. So Lara, it's a great question. What is annexation? Because it's a term that we hear a lot. Annexation literally means the taking of land, the taking of another country's land. And in this particular case, the issue of annexation has been going on for as long as the occupation has been going on, which is to say that it's been happening since 1967, since June of 1967, particularly with all of the measures that have been used, some of them labeled temporary, but that are in effect designed to be permanent. Everything from classifying land as being land that is to be used by settlements, everything from actually building those settlements to the construction of roads, taking of land to build roads so that those settlements can be accessed, to then a whole host of measures that are designed to make sure that Palestinians don't have access to that land. That process of de facto annexation, meaning in fact annexation, has been going on, has been taking place since 1967. The reason that annexation was starting to gain a lot more attention this year, over the course of the past few years, but in particular this year in the year 2020, was that the Israeli government finally decided that it was high time for it to move from being de facto annexation to being de jure, being actually legalizing and taking on those actions that will make those temporary measures into permanent measures. And so the reason that this caused so much attention was because, as I may mention at the beginning of my remarks, it's illegal under international law. You can't just go in and steal land from another country. This is the very foundational basis of international law. It's the reason that we don't have wars. If we did, then the United States could invade Canada, or Canada could invade the United States, and what have you, and begin to proclaim that territory as sovereign territory, and so on and so forth. And so what was happening this summer was that there was a lot more attention being brought to the issue of annexation, with the government saying, at the behest of the settlers, that they were going to turn this temporary situation into a more permanent situation. But I want to be clear, Lara, in saying that there were critics of the actual annexation plan that included members of previous Israeli governments. Their criticism, though, of annexation was not that they were critiquing the de facto annexation and the process that led us up to this actual demand for annexation. What their critique was is that we want to be able to have our cake and eat it too. As long as we can continue to label these measures as being temporary rather than permanent, why do we need to really shake the beehive? Why do we really need to upset the international community? We are able to build and expand settlements and demolish Palestinian homes to make way for more of those settlements without really agitating the international community. And so people like Tzipi Livni and others were saying that they were opposed to this annexation plan because they didn't want to antagonize the international community. And so their position was, let's just go back to the way that things were before, meaning we can continue to steal more land, we can continue to build more settlements, we can continue to build these roads, we can continue to exclude Palestinians, We can continue to demolish Palestinian homes, and the international community is going to say nothing. So if you ask me which is more dangerous, the de facto or the de jure, the reality is that they're both very harmful for Palestinians. And the reality is that it doesn't take a new proclamation on the part of the Israeli government to continue the harm that has already been caused since 1967. It's already the case that in major parts of the West Bank, including in the Jordan Valley, where I know that Salim has lived for some time, that Palestinians simply cannot access that land. That land has already been taken. It's already been annexed. It's already been turned into Israeli settlements. It's already been, some of the roads are already off limits to Palestinians. The only difference was that going down the path of legalization was going to change. It was going to demand an international response, a response from the international community. And that was something that many in the international community were afraid to do. So when we speak of annexation, we're seeing it even now as we speak.
So that's a great starting point, and it makes me think of something that I think a lot of us have been talking about for the past couple of years, which is, is it the people oppose annexation, or do they oppose the word annexation and talking about annexation as opposed to policies that actually are annexation? So I think we can get into that. That's a great scene setter.
That's a great way of putting it, Lara.
So I actually wrote an article about that. I'm hoping that my colleague can put that into the box. It's funny, these things, you write something, you figure this is going to be overtaken by events, and it's not. It never is in this context. So Hagai, turning to you, over the last few months, as many of us have watched that as these things, as we predicted, the actual de facto annexation, the stuff on the ground has accelerated. We've seen acceleration and demolition of Palestinian homes and structures in the West Bank, settler violence, all of these things that B'Tselem and you track in minute detail. Thank you. On US election day 2 weeks ago, the world learned that Israel razed an entire Palestinian community in the Jordan Valley, displacing 73 people, including 40 children. So can you talk a little bit about that on the ground, the ongoing dispossession, displacement, incarceration, death threats of demolitions? What's happening on the ground, and what is your analysis of these trends of what all together become annexation or are annexation in real time?
Thank you. Let me first echo Diana's gratitude for this webinar and for the work.
So your audio is going in and out a little bit, Hagai. I don't know if you can.
Are we good now?
Much better, thank you.
Okay. So first, I want to echo Diana's gratitude for the effort in making this webinar and for having me on. Thank you very much. Totally understand the desire to focus on events of recent.
So Hagai, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because people want to hear what you're saying, and like you three, if you, I don't know if you can sit closer to your microphone or maybe turn up your volume, but you're kind of going in and out.
Yeah, let's try again. Is this better?
Let's try again.
So maybe let's pause, maybe switch to Salim, come back to me, and I'll adjust the volume.
Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to switch to Salim, and we'll come back to you. So Salim, of course, my question was, Salim, following up on what Hagai just said. So Salim, speaking as a Palestinian in the West Bank, and again, someone who follows these issues very closely as an analyst and as a resident, can you talk a little bit about the types of annexation activity you are seeing playing out on the ground in real time? And here I want to ask you to also frame this, and this is something you've talked about for a long time and written about. Can you frame this in the Oslo paradigm, right? So for folks who are listening, the current events on the ground, we have areas A, B, C, all of these terms of reference that were set by the Oslo process that define land differently and different kinds of Israeli control over the land. And with respect to the conversation about annexation, this is important to understand because after 25 years of Oslo, it seems that a lot of Israelis in the Israeli government believe they now are entitled to permanently control some 60% of the West Bank, which is Area C. So can you talk about stuff on the ground and also this Oslo framing?
Thank you, Laura. I'll try my best to do the Oslo paradigm justice. It's great to be here with you and Diana and Hagai, and thank you, FMEP, for having us on. I've been visiting the Jordan Valley quite often. I'm from Jericho, and ever since there was the announcement to come from Netanyahu and his government about de jure annexation, you would go and ask the residents how they would feel about being annexed, and they would tell you, we thought we were annexed long ago. The majority of the Jordan Valley is actually in Area C, so the West Bank is cut up into Area A, B, and C, C being the largest, which is about 60 to 62%. And there, the residents don't have access to water, to their land. A lot of them have lost their farms. A lot of that water is being diverted to settlements. It's quite a grim reality. Every time I go down to speak to some of the residents, and a lot of them are actually Bedouin communities. And they, now with the lame duck period for the Trump administration, there's fear that the de facto annexation on the ground is going to accelerate. And that would mean demolition of their communities, their displacement and relocation. Now, if anyone knows anything about the Bedouin communities, they're nomadic people who live on livestock and basic farming. And to uproot a community like that from the way it's lived for centuries, I think is also quite a severe injustice. So they live in fear. They live in absolute terror. They don't know when the Israeli bulldozers might come again and demolish another community the way they did recently and left 74 people without homes. Today, actually, we were in El Bire. We were speaking to the families of Palestinian landowners who lost land to Jabal al-Tawil, which is now Sagot settlement. It's a settlement Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is set to visit, I think, tomorrow, and basically formalize Israel's annexation and acceptance of illegal settlements. And they said something very interesting. The population of El Bire in 1967 was 8,000 people. Today, it's 80,000 people. But because of the two settlements that flank El Bire, both Sagot and Beit Il, which Ambassador Friedman sends a lot of money to, they have less land than they did in 1967, and people don't have anywhere to go. This is the long, methodical, systematic annexation and theft of Palestinian land that has been incremental over the years, and has completely turned the West Bank into basically an archipelago with a bunch of Palestinian islands sinking in an ocean of Israeli control. And the reason why it happened is because of the Oslo paradigm, right? The number one rule of the Oslo paradigm is pay lip service to the two-state solution while acquiescing to Israel's policy on the ground of basically settlement construction. The world didn't challenge Israel on settlement construction for the last 30 years. And basically policy was anchored in building a Palestinian state, therefore financing a standard of living that didn't cause a humanitarian crisis or a Palestinian uprising, which also allowed Israel to manage the conflict. And what tied this whole thing together is we want to try to get the negotiation parties back to the negotiating table. And that mantra became the obsession of the international community, the US, and no one was willing to take any action. So it created I think I kind of, hello?
We hear you. Yes, we've got you. Yes.
Cool. I think my screen just froze. So it created a tolerable equilibrium for the last 30 years that removed any imperative to take action. And so the fear is that with a Biden administration, we'd be returning to that. Basically incremental annexation of Palestinian land and the complete destruction of what was supposed to be a potential Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza.
Yeah, thank you. It strikes me listening to you. I used to joke there was like the attitude in Washington was don't bother us. We're busy peace processing. Don't bother us with what Israel's doing. All of that stuff will be taken care of if we can just successfully peace process. As if the settlement movement wasn't very clear. The purpose of what was happening on the ground was to prevent getting to that solution. There's something a little bit surreal about that. Cognitive dissonance. Hagai, we have you back. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I hope you can hear me.
We hear you. Excellent. So,
okay.
Hagai, I'm going to ask you the question again. obviously, very quickly for people who maybe have heard it before, I'll go quick. So we've, as predicted, lots of terrible things happening over the past few months into the current time. The displacement of the destruction of entire community in Jordan Valley, displacement of a lot of people. Can you talk about, again, as someone who's following this in minute detail, the ongoing dispossession, displacement, threats of demolitions, detentions, all of that? What's happening on the ground, and what's your analysis of these trends?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll zoom in on what has been happening in recent weeks. But before I do that, I want to go back because already, as you mentioned, and others as well, it's new. There's always new details, and there's always statistics that will point out that this is like the worst that has been happening in the last X years. But the reason that this is so meaningful is because it has been going on for such a long time. And in that sense, the trajectory is the same trajectory that has been the trajectory for not for weeks or months or years, but the same trajectory that's been going on for decades, the same trajectory that was going on under Obama and under Trump, and very likely also the same trajectory will go also under Biden, unless we see a dramatic departure from previous policies. And I'm sure we're going to get to that later in this conversation. I think the other thing that is key to understand when analyzing this trajectory is that while Israel can accelerate or decelerate the pace of demolitions or settlement construction, basically not just this government, also previous governments have become really exquisitely experienced in identifying what is the appropriate pace. And when I say appropriate pace, I mean as much as the international community is willing to digest without introducing consequences. So like how much we can do and how fast we can do it while getting away with it. So it's not just about advancing the project. It's about advancing the project and doing that with impunity, doing that with zero consequences. That's the essential aspect. And because of that, kind of like the invitation I want to offer is for people, while continuing to focus on the news of like yesterday or a week ago or a month ago, and the news is not a small thing, like raising down an entire village is not a small thing. The news is important. But while continuing to think about that, to remember the ground rule. The ground rule is as much as we can get away with without consequences. And because of that, what's important isn't just a response to what happened yesterday. What's important is introducing consequences. That's the key thing. And until we don't get to that point, basically nothing is going to change. And we'll just be kept in this very limited spectrum between acceleration and deceleration of the same trend. And we need to break out of that trap. That's the essential aspect. Now, if I kind of like move across the West Bank from south to north, and just like highlight a few of the key areas and communities where developments have been playing out in this context. So one is, of course, Masafer Yatta in the South Hebron Hills, an area that Israel dubbed Firing Zone 918. And there's a number, some 12 Palestinian communities with more than 1,000 residents that have been fighting for the last generation, for the last 20 years in courts to be able to stay on their land. It seems that that legal case is now going to come to its conclusion within the next few months or so. That's the very likely scenario. And from everything that the judges have been saying along the hearings in that court case, it doesn't seem very likely or likely at all that they're going to say what they should have said already a very long time ago, that there is no business for the occupying army to train in an occupied land. And certainly that cannot be a justification or an excuse to displace even a single person from their home. Rather, they're very likely to come down with some sort of what they would call a compromise, but what would in fact spell out the displacement of many of these communities, if not all of them. So that's an area which we're following obviously very, very closely. If I move north and I arrive in Jerusalem, then of course there's the process that's been going on for many years already, like in Silwan in East Jerusalem, when what we're not talking about demolitions, but we're talking about Jewish families moving into the homes of Palestinians that are evicted with a court order. If I go then east of Jerusalem, we arrive at Khan al-Ahmar, which many of the viewers may be familiar with from the fights of the last 2 years or so with regard to the ability of that community to stay on its land. It's very close to the city settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, an area that Israel wants to minimize Palestinian footprint in as a very high Israeli priority. Khan al-Ahmar already has been approved twice by the High Court of Justice to greenlight the demolition orders against the community there, but the government hasn't acted on it yet. Now there's a court case coming from the extreme right in Israel demanding that the court accelerates the government's acting on these pending demolition orders. And maybe we'll get back to that again later in this conversation. And then if I could move further east, and we arrive in the Jordan Valley, where there's Homsa, which was mentioned before, Khirbet Homsa, where the demolition took place on November 3rd. And obviously, like if I go back to the ground rule I mentioned in the beginning, how much we can get away with without consequences, then obviously, I mean, I can't prove it, but it seems that the timing, election day in America, was not a coincidence. What was chosen because there was a sense that international attention will be elsewhere, elections in America, so we would actually be able to get away with that. Now, the last thing I want to say on these processes is that Homsa happened within a few hours, right? But the conditions of these communities and many other communities, which I haven't named, Palestinian communities all over Area C, have been living in this frozen reality, unable to develop while suffering from continuous Israeli actions against them. So like, just imagine like the conditions for such a community. Israel doesn't recognize your legality. You cannot be connected to running water or the electricity grid. You'll be suffering from repeated forced temporary evacuations, mostly in the Jordan Valley, because the army needs to train on your land, settler violence backed by the state, and pending demolition orders. So the civil administration will come, they demolish 2 structures, they'll leave, they'll come back in 6 months or a year, and so on. So basically what Israel is doing is making the lives of these communities into a nightmare, a very prolonged nightmare, so that eventually people will just give up and leave and go to Area A or Area B, hence gradually reducing less and less Palestinian communities in Area C, right? This is forcible transfer, right? Like this is what needs to be understood. And forcible transfer is a war crime. It doesn't matter if it plays out over the course of a few hours, as happened in Homsa, or if it happens throughout a decade of such an attitude from the government, which is meant through these prolonged policies to forcibly transfer Palestinians. It's just that if Israel is patient and does it over the course of a very long time, then the price that Israel pays is the patience, but the gain is that attention fades away and there are no consequences.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And you and Salim both touched on why all of these different things that we talk about, whether it's demolitions or displacements or the firing zone issue. I mean, all of these different policies are pieces of an annexation policy, right? All of them in the end are about clearing people off land and establishing a hold permanently, an Israeli hold on that land, which is annexation. So thank you for going into more detail on that. Salim, I want to come back to you. We talked earlier, Diana spoke about de facto versus de jure. And I want to ask you to also talk about this distinction a little bit. And where you think this terminology, this distinction that people make when they talk about this, where you think it takes us in terms of understanding, or maybe not understanding for some people, the realities on the ground, but also in terms of envisioning alternatives as we start looking, what else could happen and maybe what are things that people could focus on to try to make things better in the future.
Absolutely. Just to build on what both Diana and Haggai said, I think Israel uses de jure and de facto whenever it can to really push the limits and see what it can get away with. You know, de facto annexation has been ongoing for decades. With de jure annexation, one of the example that comes to mind was East Jerusalem in the early 1980s. You know, Israel de jure annexed East Jerusalem, and as Haggai said, there are no consequences. There's no any form of accountability. So Israel understands its ability to get away with these things. With de facto annexation, you know, it's driven Israel's policy, and it's driven us to a point today where we're very much a one-state. We live in a one-state reality where there's, you know, complete Israeli control from the river to the sea. Basically, it's a system where there are different legal statuses based on your ethno-national identity. If you're a Jewish Israeli, you have a full set of freedom and rights. If you're Palestinian, you're put into 4 different tiers. If you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you know, you're discriminated against, you're unequal against the law, etc. If you're a resident of Jerusalem, you have a different legal status, and you're at threat of losing that residency at any time. And you're also very much discriminated against from the municipality. If you're from the West Bank, or if you're in Gaza, like myself, we're under military occupation, martial law. While the settlers, there are 2 settlements right outside my window in Ramallah, they're under Israeli civilian law. So you have a country that essentially extends its own civilian law that is made in the Knesset to occupy territory already. I'm not a lawyer, you know, but I think that to me is an extension of some form of de jure annexation as well. And so there's discrimination. If I am arrested, let's say for writing a political post on Facebook, I go to a military court, there's a 99.9% chance that I'll get convicted. If an Israeli settler commits a violent crime, they're likely to not get convicted, and they're tried in an Israeli civilian court. And lastly, it's about who can return, right? Any Jewish person anywhere in the world can come back to Israel. Any Palestinian, a Palestinian refugee whose family was forced to displace or expelled from here many years ago, are not even allowed to visit the West Bank, let alone come in. So this is what annexation, both de jure and de facto, has led us to this one state reality, really, where there is one group of people that has developed an institutionalized system of control and domination and supremacy. And so to me, I think this is the starting point we need to tackle. And this is why I think it's very important to move beyond the Oslo paradigm. Because if you look at that definition under international law, it spells out apartheid, right? And so it's the moment where we need to be honest with ourselves. It's time to say, okay, how can we really dismantle this regime, this apartheid reality, and try to build a different future between the river and the sea, where the 13 million human beings living here have freedom and rights and can live in dignity and with justice. This is what we need now. And I think those who are formulating policy, whether political, diplomatic, or financial towards this place, need to understand without consequences, without accountability, we cannot begin to dismantle this system that has been driven by this annexation.
Thank you for that. And I will just, as an observation, as somebody who's worked on this issue for years, and you guys all know this, I mean, the question of using the word apartheid has been a hot one for many years. It is interesting that not as a consequence of Israel's policy on the ground, but as a consequence of the discussion about annexation, you sort of finally, at long last, have people looking at this and saying, and also the Trump plan saying, this is apartheid, at least with respect to the West Bank, saying this is apartheid. And I think more people looking at it and saying, I don't know how you can distinguish between the West Bank and Israel. It's all one rule from the river to the sea. And that opens up, at least I think for a lot of people, more of a question. Let them think a little harder about this. And that maybe is positive. Diana, I want to come back to you. In terms of immediate annexation moves, de facto and de jure, I want you to talk a little bit about the things that are on your radar. What things can happen now with a green light from Trump before Biden is sworn in. You know, and some of us, I think we hesitate to write articles about this because we don't want to give the settlers a list of things they can do, right? But the reality is they're thinking full time, and the BB people are. And so what else is on your radar? And I know there's, you know, we talked a little bit before we started the webinar about what's happening in Jerusalem, if you want to touch on that, but for this lame duck period. And I also want to throw in another question, just very quickly. You talked at the beginning, and you are a world expert on this, on de facto versus de jure annexation and international law. Can you touch on the shift in international law articulated by the Trump administration, where in fact they are reinterpreting international law to say you can annex other people's lands? Can you touch on that and explain that for the crowd a little bit, and whether or not that has any validity?
Sure, great. Thank you. Both really good questions again. In terms of what's on my radar, there's two main things that are on my radar. This isn't just a lame duck president. It's also a lame duck ambassador. And it's those two processes, those two actors that I'm very worried about. So this isn't just about what the Trump administration on its own accord. Trump is much more concerned with tweeting at this moment than he is about anything else. It's not so much just about what the administration is going to do. I'm actually a lot more concerned with what Friedman is going to do, what he's going to green light, and what Israel is going to be pushing for as well. Now, it's important to keep in mind that I think it was back in May, when there were full-blown discussions about annexation in the Knesset, that Netanyahu came forward and said, this is an opportunity that we're not going to let pass. We're not going to miss this opportunity. We're not going to let it pass. And so I do very much think that they are looking at these next, however many weeks it is, we're down, I think down to 9 weeks now, of, and saying to themselves, what is it that can be done within these 9 weeks? And so the range is everything from accelerating the home demolitions that we've already been hearing about, to, as we saw over the course of the past 48 hours, the issuing of tenders to expand settlements, particularly in and around the Jerusalem area, with those tenders closing the day before Biden takes office, to then even beyond that, to even perhaps pushing forward full steam ahead when it comes to this issue of annexation. And let's see whether a Biden presidency is going to roll that back. I'm not so certain that they will. So the things that are on my radar are very much the things that we saw on our radar in the transition between 2008 and 2009, as we're seeing now. So if you'll recall, in 2008, 2009, immediately after the election of Obama, that was when we saw a huge spike in settlement activity, but it was also the time that we saw the first major attack on Gaza in Cast Lead at the end of December of 2008. And for both of those events, the phraseology that President Obama used was, there's only one president at a time, even though he did speak up when it came to a whole host of other issues. And similarly now, when it comes to Biden, although in a different context, he's been talking mostly about COVID, he's also said there's only one president at a time. He's used that exact same phraseology. So I'm really worried about everything from, as I mentioned, the home demolitions, the settlement activity, to full-scale annexation measures that we're going to see both pushed through by the Israeli government, as well as by the current U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, and see with them creating such havoc that it's some measures that cannot be undone. Now, in terms of what the Trump administration's policy has been when it comes to international law, their position has been that there really is no such thing as international law any longer. That it's with the passage of time, and Haggai mentioned this in his comments, is that there was just a question of being patient, that with the passage of time, it is okay to extend sovereignty. And so we saw this when it came to the issue of the Golan Heights, when one of the remarks that they made was that they, being the US administration, made, was that Israel has been in such control for such a long period of time. And so the Trump administration's position has just been that with the passage of time, international law doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the facts on the ground. And my fear is just in the same way that the Biden administration, that Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and I don't see that Biden is going to undo that move. I'm also equally afraid that they will not scale back on some of these major pronouncements, such as the Golan Heights, but also if large swaths of the West Bank are to now be annexed. I think that what they're trying to do now is grab as much as they can, as Haggai said it, take as much Palestinian land with as few Palestinian people, and do as much to make sure that these measures cannot be undone in the future.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, relative to what both of you said, it seems to me that it's not just about them not being undone, it's about 25 years of a peace process approach from the US, which essentially accommodates whatever Israel does, right? There isn't any ethos of trying to roll things back. We've reframed the entire peace process, so it's an Israeli concession just to slow down or suspend what it's doing. There's never a requirement to roll back. And that's been US policy under every president, basically, right? I'll add to the concerns you've articulated. I'm deeply concerned looking at some of the things that have come out from the same people who were around in the Obama era, who effectively argued that the US should shift policy on settlements and not protest settlements that are built in the areas that everybody knows, which is basically Area C, which looks, at that point, you end up with a policy that looks a lot like the Trump plan, even if you don't annex anything, right? So there's peril here for the next administration, and it's not about Trump at that point. It isn't about, this all started before Trump. So going back to Haggai, okay, I want to talk about the international community. I know you just did a big address for the Europeans. So the international community has at various times expressed different levels of alarm about the Trump administration. I would argue far insufficient. It took, for those of us who meet with Europeans in particular, it has been a very slow process for Europe to actually admit that the situation was as bad as it is, far too slow. And with the Trump plan coming out, which basically gives a green light to annexation of around 60% of the West Bank as a starting point, this suddenly you did see a rise in alarm and pushback from the international community, which then dissipated when official annexation was taken off the table, suspended, not canceled or anything, suspended in the name of pursuing normalization. So looking at that, today, what do you make of, we've been talking about the focus on the US, but the international community, how the international community reacts to the threat of de jure annexation versus its relative passivity when it comes to the ongoing de facto annexation? And where do you see that going now as these things are heating up these past few weeks? We've had another one of those tests to see, will the international community stand up and be counted as we have these tests put before it? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it makes you want to tear your hair out with frustration and rage. And to say it's been extremely frustrating wouldn't even be an understatement. It doesn't even come, close enough to how bitter I feel, and I think many of us with regard to this period. I mean, if I go back to the points that were raised by Israeli centrists, Diana already related to that earlier, in their criticism of why do we need to bother with de jure, right? They were saying that not because they were contemplating giving Palestinians justice, liberty, or rights. They were not talking about that. They were just saying, we have a very well-lubricated, well-functioning system that gives us everything that we want. We have total control. We do whatever we want, wherever we want, right? And we suffer no consequences. It's not broken. Why fix it? Why go through the trouble? And you can just imagine, such arguments, internally, right? It's also this is morally repugnant. You have Israeli leadership arguing with itself with regard to what is our preferred choice of permanent subjugation of Palestinians. Do we do it this way or do we do it that way, right? Like I don't find myself like anywhere inside that argument, but that's the argument that we have been, that's been playing out, since January through August. And you can just imagine some of the back and forths going on in that conversation, right? Someone supports de jure and the response should be, well, show me the piece of Palestinian land you want to take that you can't do it now. You can only, that you can't do it with de facto. Show me the Palestinian home you want to demolish. You can't demolish that home. These places do not exist. We do whatever we want already. And if that's not enough, we already have a system through military law and through other measures in which we make changes also to the laws that govern the occupied territory without de jure annexation to accelerate what we need to accelerate and to make things easier for us and so on. And the last one in that context, I should have emphasized that already before, is that also all this has been litigated, and variations on the theme have been litigated for decades in the Israeli High Court of Justice, and that court has approved all this, right? So domestically, everything is working, everything is fine. And yet, right, the international community has decided to put so much emphasis on pushing back against that, but not pushing back against the facts on the ground, right? So we had all that, since January through August, and now a huge sigh of relief, right? But the decision not to push back against facts on the ground is a decision that brought us to where we are now, right? So 600,000 settlers in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, that didn't happen in a day. That's a choice that was made to allow that process to develop and to reach the point that it has arrived at. So with that in mind, you kind of have to ask yourself, what does this actually spell out? What does it actually reveal with regard to the real strategy and the real acceptance that is behind this? Because if you listen closely, then I fear that what you eventually hear is kind of like the international community telling Israel, don't call our bluff, right? You, Israel, you can go on doing to Palestinians whatever you want. We're fine with that. We're even fine with Homsa, right? And we're fine with the blockade on Gaza, and we're fine with, firing demonstrators there with live, we're fine with everything, the demolitions and the settlements, everything's okay. No consequences. We'll express concern on occasion, but we're good with everything that you do. There's only one thing that you shouldn't do. Don't formalize this. Don't call it by its name. And you have to ask yourself, what is that really about? Why is that such a focus on just not naming it, not giving a formal announcement of what has actually already happened? Why is the focus on that? And then if you go back to the stated positions that are repeatedly said all the time. So if there's, Israeli actions that the international community would want Israel to refrain from doing, then there's an expression of concern that doesn't really solve anything, doesn't reverse anything, and obviously also gives the green light for that thing to happen again because it's meaningless, right? While at the same time talking about, quote unquote, supporting the two-state solution, right? So it seems that the comfort zone that the international community is good with is that as long as Israel doesn't announce de jure, they have enough deniability to continue singing the empty song about support for the two-state solution while watching it evaporate in front of everyone's eyes at the expense of the rights of Palestinians, while in fact, the reality that we live in is exactly the reality that Salem described. One-state reality, which is inherently undemocratic. And as long as Israel doesn't name it, the international community seems to be okay with it. Last thing I just want to say is that, part of our way of more constructively venting the anger that I've tried to express now is through a position paper that we published a couple of weeks ago. You can find it on the B'Tselem website. It's the annexation that was and still is, right? And in it, we describe what we've been talking about in this webinar. And we also like zoomed in also on some like the more recent de facto aspects of what's been happening, including some of like the major infrastructure projects that Israel is investing in, especially now in the greater Jerusalem area. And again, if people want to think for a second about, temporary occupation, and then just like imagine these permanent, huge, major infrastructure projects, you see the contradiction right there, right? So how is it that people are still talking about this as a temporary reality as long as Israel doesn't say that that's what it is? We see it right in front of our eyes, and we know better than that.
Yeah, I've got to say, I mean, I covered settlements for the State Department in the early 90s, 92 to 94. And I remember, driving out in the West Bank, the first time we saw the tunnel road that had been this huge tunnel just south of Jerusalem. And at that time, people insisting this is a temporary occupation in the 90s. That was during the heart of the peace process, right? And it's like, okay, this is this massive, I think at the time it was the largest tunnel project in the Middle East. And it's like, this doesn't look temporary at all. By the way, for people who are interested, I was laughing, the sound was off while Haggai was talking, because a friend of a lot of ours, Hugh Lovett from ECFR, has started posting on Twitter the concernometer, I think he calls it, where you can see the arrow of European concern in responding to various announcements. Sorry, did you want to add something, Haggai?
Yeah, just to say that one of the infrastructure projects that I was referring to now is actually like the doubling of that tunnels and bridges highway leading south from Jerusalem. And the reason that Israel is investing in that is because of plans to expand settlements in that area so that the settlers in the entire southern West Bank will have an easier commute into Jerusalem. Right?
Exactly. So Deanna, I'm coming back to you now. So let's talk about the Trump plan a little bit. The Trump plan seeks, among other things, to impose a shift in the terms of reference, right? To shift people's entire thinking around what the outcome must be, shall be, will be, and really to legitimize the idea that Israel will retain control over most of the West Bank, sovereignty over all settlements, and that is a viable way to some sort of peace agreement with the Palestinians. Can you talk about what you think the legacy of this plan is when Trump leaves office? We lived for years. You and I have known each other a long time. The Clinton parameters. I mean, my goodness, that was the touchstone for long after Mr. Clinton left office. After Obama, I think the idea was that the Kerry plan or Kerry parameters would be there. So what will the legacy of this be? And to the extent that the Trump plan is something like a truth serum, an X-ray of what the actual intentions are there positive aspects to this? Are there things that can't be undone, like you said, the Trump policies, like maybe Golan annexation or Jerusalem embassy? But are there also things that this leaves behind that are potentially opportunities for shifts in policy from others?
Thanks again. So, when I think of the Trump plan, it's both two elements: what's in it and then what's not in it. And so I'll speak about what's not in it. And what's not in it is any concept of equality. What's not in it is any idea that there is a legal reference point, being international law. What's not in it is any sense that Palestinians that have rights or any of that sort of thing. What is in it and what its foundation is that this is the kind of the right-wing checklist or dream wish list that the Trump administration has ticked off item by item by item. And what that means is that if you think back to what it is that Israel wants, and this is not just this administration, but previous administrations, all the way back to the beginning of the peace process, is they want Palestinian land. They just don't want the Palestinians on that land. And so this is why we see that all throughout the period of Oslo, these 27 years, that the West Bank was divided up into these three areas that Salem has already mentioned. Area A being the smallest of those areas, but with the highest concentration of Palestinians, and that's only 18% of the West Bank. Add to that area B, which is 22% of the West Bank, also less, it's a high concentration of Palestinians, but less than Area A. And then you have the remainder, which is 60+% of the West Bank. And that's where you see very few Palestinians. So what the Trump plan, and that's Area C, and what the Trump plan is cementing is that it's no longer a question of Palestinians having rights to all of that land because it's occupied territory. Instead, it's that Palestinians should be grateful that they're being given parts of area, that they're being given Area A and then parts of Area B. So the framing is now that Palestinians are interlopers. We're the ones who just happen to be there. We're the ones who are getting in the way of this greater state of Israel. And so in order to do away with the problem, we're going to throw you some crumbs, and those crumbs being Area A and parts of Area B. The other parts of the Trump plan that are in there that I don't think are going to go away anytime soon is that Jerusalem is completely off limits to Palestinians. We saw this happening all the way in the Trump and then later on Kerry and so on. But also very alarmingly is that Palestinian citizens of Israel are now part of this equation and that they are to be swapped out. And I can tell you that there is real fear here. I live in Haifa, not too far away from those areas that there is talk of quote unquote swapping. There is real fear that Israel is going to eventually get rid of the triangle, the Untitled area, which consists of Palestinian citizens of Israel, Fahim and so on, and denationalize them, make them into part of the Palestinian state. So these are the elements that have been long lasting. And the overwhelming part of it, and this is from my discussions with a lot of diplomats, is that, and you'll remember this, Lara, all throughout the period of negotiations, Palestinians were constantly being told that we needed to be quote unquote pragmatic. That we didn't need to focus on legal issues. We needed to be focused on being pragmatic. And what that is code for is you need to accept that you are a lesser, and because you are a lesser, you should just take whatever crumbs are thrown your way. What that does is that it feeds into the Israeli mindset that we should build more and take more and expand more, because at the end of the day, it's just the Palestinians who need to be pragmatic. One thing for me, and I'll end this question with this, what that was alarming was that when the Trump plan was released, there really wasn't a lot of pushback inside Israel against, even when they saw a map. There wasn't really massive pushback saying, look, this looks like Bantustans, or this looks like apartheid, or this is absolutely ridiculous, or how dare this even be on an issue. Instead, the pushback was, oh, they're planning on giving parts of the Negev to the Gaza Strip. How dare they do that? And so these things, Lara, for me, are the issues that are frightening, and I think because they're going to be so long lasting.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for reminding us. I think a lot of people forget that one of the things that people didn't notice, and I think even I didn't expect in the Trump plan, was legitimizing this idea that had been promoted by the hardest line racist members of the Israeli political system, that a plan should include trying to cut out parts of sovereign Israel where there are too many Arabs, basically. And when I explain this to Americans, I explain this, it's as if you have a very racist and openly racist president who is suggesting a plan that would cut out parts of Arizona and Texas, where there's a lot of Latinos living. Well, we'll make that part of Mexico. We'll improve our demographic balance by evicting our own citizens. And the fact that this actually showed up in the Trump plan, I think, is something that a lot of people have overlooked in terms of a sea change in normalizing what is, I mean, brazenly anti-democratic, but is also just openly racist towards one's own citizens. Certainly citizens of Israel who are Palestinians have not missed that. Salam, I want to ask you to go on a little bit from your perspective. Again, I want to just sort of use this round to talk about the Trump plan. And, you know, I have suggested, I think in a previous question, one of the positive aspects, if we're going to look for constructive ways to think about this, or constructive things to say, one of the positive aspects of this Trump period and the Trump plan is it really has just laid bare intentions. So if people like myself or Hagai or Diana, Salim, you're a little younger, but for years we're always really careful when we talk about the settlements and occupation because we get accused of attributing intent. Like, you're not inside people's head. How can you say what they want? And my answer has always been the settlers are very clear on what they want. I don't know why you're hiding from what they say their intention is. But now we have a clear intent, right? The intent is to hold on to most of the West Bank with an apartheid-like Bantustan situation, blah, blah, blah. That seems to me like a liberating element. Can you talk about what that sort of new level of honesty maybe opens up as a Trump legacy that maybe is unintentional?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think the first thing is that the Oslo paradigm that I think Trump deviated from was purgatory in many ways, because there was a gaslighting of Palestinians for a very long time about about a two-state solution that did not reflect the reality on the ground. People were approaching this as if we were in 1991 rather than 2020, and that, you know, I was too young back then to remember. But the Trump plan wasn't just the deal of the century, right? It was many things. It was an assault on the Palestinian right of self-determination. And he went after the pillars of Palestinian politics and society. He went after the refugees. He went after political prisoners. He went after Jerusalem. And we need to see the normalization deals that are happening now between Arab states as part of a diplomatic pressure point to isolate Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership into capitulation, right? That's the legacy of Trump. In a way, he took us out of purgatory because he, through the deal of the century, as Diana said, basically recognized the reality we were in today. And that for us finally enabled us to challenge this constant purgatory and say, listen, you know, here's a radical extremist American administration that is recognizing that. And this is where we need to start. And this is where policy needs to be developed around. Policy cannot be statements. It needs to be proportional to what is essentially challenging the foreign policy interests of a lot of countries around the world, but it's not. And so I don't have much hope for Biden in terms of reversing a lot of these things. And you know, my advice to Palestinians is to not bet too much on Biden, right? I think this is the time to articulate a new vision for the future based on the facade I think Trump damaged and destroyed. But I think it goes back to this tolerable equilibrium that a lot of people are comfortable with, which removes any need to take action. And it seems to me, you know, we deviated from purgatory into hell, but it's back into purgatory again.
So in purgatory, Hagai, coming to you now. I also want you to comment on the Trump legacy. And I would add to what Salim has just laid out. Part of the legacy is also the wholesale delegitimization of Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian cause. And I'll add in here the international effort around redefining anti-Semitism to effectively include anything that is critical of Israel in a significant way, and effectively defining the Palestinian national historical lived narrative as anti-Semitic because it delegitimizes Israel or challenges Israel's existence. That's the legacy as well. That's all taken off during this Trump era. And with that as the baseline, are there things, Hagai, do you see any of this as being reversible? And if so, can you talk to us about that? And do you see any of this as an opportunity for, whether it's for Europe or for the United States, in this post-Trump era to move things in a different direction as opposed to try to restore status quo ante, which I keep reminding people will be status quo ante minus, not status quo ante, and status quo ante sucked. So this will suck more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Yeah, I think everything is reversible, but the question is like really in what direction do we want to go, right? Because as already was said, this is not about like reversing things in the sense of going back 4 years. Like what we need is something completely different than that. But before I go there, I just want to go back to like 2 points that Diana made before, one about Jerusalem and the other one about exporting Palestinian citizens to the future Bantustan non-state that would be given to Palestinians. And just like to spell out like how dehumanizing that is, right? Like the process around Jerusalem, I refer to it in the direction of like making the metropolitan center that Jerusalem is more accessible for settlers by investing in infrastructure north, south, and east of the city, right? But this is happening at the very same time that the opposite is done for Palestinians. And for Palestinians, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Ramallah, all around the West Bank is their metropolitan center as well in numerous ways. So just like to pause and think like how dehumanizing it is for this process to be happening at the same time in opposite directions and in a totally visible and very clear way. And also like to pause and think about like what it means to spell out like treating people as pawns, that like you can one day be a citizen and maybe another day be something else. And so like how dehumanizing the message that sends is, because like that's the reality that we live in. And we shouldn't just think of it in formal terms or in legal terms. We should also think about it in very personal terms, because that is what it actually is. And people are suffering under that dehumanizing reality.
And I would just add, I mean, in the context of things like the nation state law, all of these, as you know, my friends and family will will defend Israel. It's a democracy and blah, blah. Like these are very undemocratic trends, and they're undemocratic acts that specifically single out the non-Jewish population that is of Palestinian ethnicity. I mean, this is the antithesis of what democracy is supposed to be. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. Now looping back to the question about like the Trump legacy and what can be done. As already was said, I mean, you called it a truth serum, and I totally agree. And I think the biggest contribution that we have here is, maybe I'd call it like an unmasking, right? Like what we had already before is US foreign policy that underwrote what Israel did to Palestinians while paying the lip service to the two-state solution, but actually at the same time, not only not using American direct leverage to convince Israel to act differently, but also to shield Israel from consequences in other institutions. The key example, obviously, is the UN Security Council, right? Trump is unmasking. Trump is saying the quiet part out loud, right? And that's the world that we lived in during the last 4 years. The question now, as that world is expiring, is what is the future? Like, are we just gonna go back to like a more polite version of what we had before, which obviously is totally unacceptable, or do we have a chance at something different? So if the conversation is about the spectrum between a more polite or a less polite form of permanent oppression of Palestinians, I'm not interested, right? Like that's not the conversation we need to be in, and we can be in that conversation for the next half century. There's no problem with that. That's like very easy, very smooth. A lot of international stakeholders would feel very comfortable, unfortunately, with that question. I think the question for progressives everywhere in America, especially, but not only, is what is it that we are about? What is it we can do to try and push things in a very different direction and towards a different vision? But it's not just about the vision, it's also about the measures that will be taken in order to depart from the reality that we're also very familiar with. And with that would be like a new paradigm. It's not that I have like a plan, but I do want to make two suggestions in that direction. One is to put rights, values, and justice front and center, right? Not the process leading to I don't know what and so on, which is always the excuse for rights and justice to wait and take the back seat, but to do it the other way around, right? Because the way Israel is running the lives of Palestinians, it never puts on hold the violation of the rights of Palestinians. So we should never put on hold the protection of their rights. This shouldn't wait for anything. That should become a centerpiece of American foreign policy, European foreign policy, independently of a peace process or no peace process, and so on. The other key aspect, obviously, and I already touched upon it before, is accountability, right? What allows all this to go on in such a successful manner from the Israeli perspective is impunity. Consequences have to be introduced.
Thank you. We're going to run a little bit over because I want to go one more round. And I've been weaving audience questions in as we go. We have a lot of questions. And I want to reassure people that all those questions will be shared with the panelists so they will know what you're thinking about. And they're also going to help us shape ideas for future webinars. There's a bunch of questions about annexation inside pre-48 Israel or pre-67, the Green Line. And I think that is a rich vein that we should be looking to mine in another webinar. So don't worry, your questions matter. In this last round, I actually want to stick with Haggai for a minute. Haggai, talk to us, and there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A about this. Talk to us about Israel, the debate inside Israel, the debate around annexation, which doesn't seem to really exist inside Israel, except whether it's like, you know, what we talked about before. Should we keep doing what we're doing, or should we talk about annexation? Either way, let's keep doing what we're doing. But the framing in Israeli politics appears to really be, at this point, for us watching it, you have an extreme right, and you have a moderate center right. And there doesn't seem to be a left, and there doesn't seem to be a debate inside Israel that sees the fate of Palestinians in occupation as relevant to people's lives. Am I wrong? And if that is correct, what is the way forward? What about Israelis how do you make people care about occupation and annexation? Or does this come back to what you said earlier? Does it really all come back to the question of consequences? And then I want you to bring it in that, if that's the answer, what should, in your view, Mr. Biden do?
Yeah, I mean,
and get ready, Salim and Diana, because you're getting similar questions.
You asked and you answered. I was about to apologize that I'm going to repeat myself, and then you did it for me. Yeah, people, the reality isn't going to change as long as a cost is introduced to make this issue into a priority. And the issue is not a priority because there are no costs. And this is not like an assessment that, you know, I'm saying, you know, because this is my opinion. It's what public opinion polls demonstrate, and it's what the results of repeated elections in this country demonstrate, right? That the issue of the rights of Palestinians is a non-issue, and people are voting on other issues, and morality alone just isn't going to cut it. Sometimes you have these, like, you know, very almost like theatrical spelling out of to what extent the debate, as if there is one, is such limited in spectrum, right? So for instance, like I already mentioned before, like the community of Khan el-Ahmar, east of Jerusalem, and again, like the court cases that are playing out around that. Khan el-Ahmar became political soccer in Israeli politics, where Netanyahu is being critiqued not only from the right, but also from the center for not having already demolished that community, right? And again, I talked about dehumanization before. I think this is one of like the most appalling expressions of dehumanization. The faith of an entire community becoming political soccer. And that's, again, a community of people that have no vote, right? Completely transparent. And yet people may seem to assess that the destruction of their lives would be politically beneficial as a cause for them to support and to get more votes by the class of people that do get to vote in the elections in this country. And in the most recent legal skirmish on Khan el-Ahmar, it was published that actually Minister Gantz, the alternative prime minister and the defense minister, was actually pushing that the state's response to the court would be that they are ready to move ahead with demolitions. So there was an internal argument in which apparently Netanyahu was not as assertive as Gantz was on the issue. And eventually they reached a compromise in which they filed to the court that they're asking for a 4 months extension, right?
So like, if you need to have the entire story digested into like a very brief anecdote, right? Then that's the story, right? The oppressing class debating internally about the details of oppression and demolition and subjugation of Palestinians, reaching its own compromises and then acting on them. This is not going to change until a cost is introduced. And the last thing in that context, it's the key example. It's the expression of former prime minister and at the time defense minister under Netanyahu, Ehud Barak, that warned of a diplomatic tsunami that Israel will need to face. An expression that Netanyahu keeps quoting and telling the public here, see, that was a false warning. There was no tsunami. We have no problem. This is successful. I got it. Vote for me, right? And it's not just Netanyahu, the prime minister, like anyone that would replace him could have the same line, and it would be a very convincing line because it's correct. You want to make a difference, you need a tsunami. Otherwise, it's going to stay the same.
Yeah, and I would add for until COVID, I was going to Brussels every few months, and numerous times I said to colleagues in the EU and in Brussels missions, I would say, well, look, you engage on Khan al-Ahmar, it made a difference. This shows that engagement can make a difference. And literally every single time the response I got was, well, yeah, but they're going to eventually demolish it and we're not going to do anything. Like that was the response I got from the Europeans. It really, the question of is there political will, it always comes down to that. Diana, I want to come to you. I'm sorry.
I was actually going to add to what Hagai said really quickly, just to give you a flavor of what it's like for the people of Khan al-Ahmar. This community has been living under threat of demolition since 2009. And so if you could imagine that this school for 11 years has still remained standing, but not without substantial support from people around. And yet when you go there and you speak to the people of Khan al-Ahmar, they'll tell you that their homes are packed. They're just waiting for that moment to come when they will actually be demolished. So if you can imagine what it's like to spend 11 years of your life with all of your possessions, all of your belongings packed, just waiting for the bulldozers to show up in the middle of the night to terrify you, and for then you to have no place to go. That's what it's been like for this community for 11 years. And so when we talk about dehumanization, it's the constant threat that they are living with, that they know that eventually they're going to be removed from Khan al-Ahmar. They know it, and it's just really a question of time. And yet they're still clinging on in the hopes that people will be putting into place some of those consequences that Hagai is talking about.
Which is worth adding is a threat that hangs over the heads of a huge percentage of the population of East Jerusalem, which can't get building permits. So they're forced to build illegally on their own land. And there's video, I know B'Tselem had a video going around this week of just the last week of demolitions in Jerusalem. And it's, you try to imagine, what would happen if this was happening to Israeli Jewish citizens. This happens to Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. But I mean, there's something so dehumanizing. You forget that there's people in people's lives here. Deanna, I want to come back to you sort of as a final question here. Yeah. And I want to put you on the spot. First of all, in your previous capacity, working with the Palestinian negotiating team, and also as someone who's worked with Americans for years. So imagine yourself, you have suddenly become simultaneously an advisor to the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, and an advisor to the Biden team. What are you telling them to do right now? Recognizing as a political, someone who's worked in this for years, the realities, what advice should they be getting, and what would you hope that they're doing?
So first, Laura, I thought we were friends. I didn't think you'd catapult me back into that life. Look, I think that if I were to step back now and give advice, it's kind of what's happening right now is the opposite of the advice that I would be giving, which is we just heard yesterday that the Palestinian Authority is now resuming security collaboration with Israel. And the reason that it's doing that is because it wants to send the signal to the Biden administration that we're the good guys, you know, we're the ones who are going to be cooperative. And so we're still all in when it comes to this peace process. I think instead what they should be looking for on the Palestinian Authority side or the PLO side is a totally new framework. The PA is not working. It hasn't worked for more than 2 decades now. They've spent the past 2.5 decades traveling around to make sure to collect enough funds that really just alleviates the burden of the occupation on Israel. It's like, you know, Israel gets to occupy and we have to scramble around for the funds for us, for the world to pay for it. And so I think instead they should be really thinking of a very new form of leadership, a very new entity, rather than the Palestinian Authority. I think that they should be trying to project east rather than to west, and thinking of ways that there can be much more sustainability for Palestinians on the ground, while at the same time pushing for accountability, pushing for sanctions, pushing to make those consequences that Haggai is talking about, make those consequences actually happen. When it comes to the Biden administration, I know that they're going to be very comfortable going back to the status quo ante. And as you already mentioned, the status quo ante wasn't so great to begin with. It's going to be the status quo ante minus, just in the same way that it was the Clinton parameters minus. And so I think that they should also be looking for to push for in a very, very different way. I just know that they won't. And I know that they won't because the peace process has given these 3 main parties a great deal of comfort. It's given Israel a lot of comfort to be able to say that they're engaged in a peace process, meanwhile take more land, and they get the bonus points of being engaged in a peace process. It gives the US the comfort of being able to say that they're doing something when in reality, it's not they're doing nothing, they're actually being harmful in supporting Israel, because that's what they do. And then it gives the Palestinian Authority a great deal of comfort by not having to face the hard questions of leadership. We have not had elections here since 2005 for the president and 2006 for the parliament. And that's just the West Bank and Gaza. And the PLO, we haven't seen elections for more than 2.5 decades. So, it's high time that all of that needs a massive shakeup. Laura, we're already seeing that that there are some shifts that are happening. We're already seeing that on the public opinion poll level, that at least 1/3 of Palestinians support one state. And this is remarkable given that there's not a single political party on either side of the green line that's actively supporting this or pushing for this. So to see that 1/3 are already pressing for this is significant. Plus, we're also seeing that public opinion polls are showing that Palestinians, if they don't necessarily support one state, they're not necessarily supporting 2 states either. And so it's time that this new energy be brought to, a new thinking be brought to bear. When I think of my time that I've been here, I've lived through just waiting for the next president, just waiting for the next president, just waiting for the next president. And the consequences of sort of waiting for the stars to align, to have the perfect US president and the perfect Israeli prime minister and the perfect Palestinian leader, and the stars are never going to align. So we have to take things into our own hands and start shifting gears.
So Salem, thank you, Diana. That's really, really helpful. I want Salem to pick up on that, and I want Salem to. So Salem, the work you're doing at PIPD, and I know I've known you for a long time. You are one of those people who is engaged at the grassroots level, and you're engaged in both helping inform and sort of. I see you as someone who has their pulse on both public opinion and the direction of the sort of the intellectual ferment, which in Palestinian society the politics are deeply embedded, right? At the grassroots level, everybody is an expert on this. It's Israel and Palestine both. where does this go? What should Palestinians be doing in this period? We are at one of those pivot points, right? It's not going to be a sea change. I agree with Deanna. I think it's highly unlikely, but it is as my colleague Denny Seidemann would say, the cement is a little wet right now, right? There's an opportunity to put impressions into the cement. So what should Palestinians be doing vis-a-vis their own leadership and vis-a-vis the international community and a Biden administration? And what do you see them doing with that?
Thanks, Lara. Diana's answer was pretty comprehensive, so I'll try to build on it where I can. My plea is that to the Palestinian leadership is to move away from even now the politics of dependency. Biden and his administration is not going to deliver our liberation. It's not going to deliver the state they seek. They're just wasting 4 more years in this purgatory that we talked about already, while millions of Palestinians are suffering. And so this is the time to rebuild. This is the time to reform. This is the time to reconcile. This is the time to build unity. It's time to end fragmentation. It's not even about elections. We don't even have a political system that allows 13 million Palestinians around the world a voice and a way to shape their national strategy and a new vision forward, built on the reality we're starting from today. This is what we need to take the next 4 years and invest in. Otherwise, this dark chapter is going to turn even worse. And for me, that starts with PLO reform and PNC elections. And it starts with a reimagining of what mechanisms deliver services in Palestine to continue resilience. And a lot of the international community, including the Europeans, etc., need to ask themselves, do we make this environment more conducive or less conducive for Palestinian success? We're not asking you to deliver our freedom and rights, but you, unfortunately to us, have an impact over the trajectory of our lives. And so even on the democratic systems, at the end of the day, when Palestinians protest in Ramallah against, PA sanctions on Gaza, it's the security services paid and trained by European money that is meeting them in the streets, beating them and imprisoning them. And then they lecture us about democracy. So this is very important to understand. There's complicity across the board, but we do have to start with ourselves. And this is extremely important. The majority of Palestinian society is young. And this is where the grassroots comes in, Lara. The majority of us are under 30. This is the Oslo generation. This is the generation that saw this facade, that saw the lip service to 2 states, but then saw annexation, saw settlement construction, saw the right to their self-determination, disappear. And at the end of the day, you ask any Palestinian, what do you want? They'll tell you, I want my freedom and rights. There's no ideological tie to a specific political solution. I think ultimately, if there's a social contract between the river and the sea that offers everyone, regardless of who they are, where they come from, freedom, justice, equality, and rights, there will be acceptance for that. And I think this is where we need to be headed. And we need the political vehicle through a political system to do that. And that starts with reform, unity, reconciliation, and elections, not a Biden administration.
So I think that's a very powerful place to leave it. I want to add just one note on the Biden administration, which is we don't know what they're going to do. I'm not an optimist about this, but I have to hold out hope that they will recognize that not only is there an enormous challenge left for them by the Trump administration's decimation of what were at least the principles of US policy, but it's also an opportunity. And I've been joking, it's an opportunity. It's like your house has been hit by a tornado. This house was poorly built. It was leaking. It had a tendency to catch on fire. The house has now been hit by a tornado. You have an option of trying to spend all your time to rebuild that house, finding every little splinter and piecing it back together and still have a terrible house. Or you have an option of trying to build something that serves the same purpose, a better purpose in the same place. And I still have to hope that they will see an opportunity. And the Palestinians as well will see an opportunity, and maybe Israel as well. So we will see. On that, hopefully a slightly positive note, thank you all Diana, Salim, Hagai, you've given us generously of your time. Thank you to everyone who has stayed on. We have almost 300 people on this live, including like 270 who stayed on for the whole thing. Wow. The recording will be on our website soon. It's already on Facebook Live. So thank you, everybody. And for everyone who submitted questions that I didn't get to, rest assured those will be shared. I would also give a shout out. We did a podcast yesterday on the Pezagot situation with Fadi Quran and Dror Etkes. It's fabulous. You should listen to that. And then check back our website, www.fmep.org, for information about future webinars and for resources related to this webinar. They'll be posted at that site. And in the chat box, you should have seen the Twitter handles and relevant websites for all of our speakers. You should follow all of them as well. So with that, we will end it. Thank you all so very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.